Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. I wonder if it's still there to this day. I was told that it came about as something of an unholy agreement between Tarrytown Children's Center, which was the preschool at the church I served in Austin, and the retirement housing complex just next door. The properties met at the playground of our preschool and the common area, the common garden area of the apartments. It was an area that was shielded by tall oak trees from the central Texas sun, and it provided tranquility for those on one end of life's age spectrum and adventure for those on the other end. And when those buildings were constructed in the 1950s, it was thought that those two contexts might cancel one another out, the serenity and the adventure not quite fitting well together. Raucous children at play and retirees enjoying the serenity of the garden. So, a lovely stone wall was constructed between the two. And at some point in the decades after construction, but before I arrived as pastor, a problem arose. It doesn't rain very much in Central Texas, but when it does, it really rains. The wall between the properties wasn't built with adequate weeping ports or a deep enough foundation to withstand those forces. So in time, it started to lean a bit, and with time, a little bit more, until it hung somewhat ominously over the swing set. That beautiful ivy-covered wall was moving quickly from perceived danger to actual danger. So a meeting was called between church leaders and the management of the retirement home to decide what should be done. And I'm wondering if the solution they decided upon is still there even now. Repairing the wall wasn't really a possibility because the problem was its foundation. Repair would mean replacement entirely, extraordinarily expensive for the retirement village to whom it officially belonged, and a prospect likely to die a political death at the hands of the retirement home board anyway. But leaving the wall in its place wasn't a possibility either, as that would require completely relocating the playground of the children's center, and there was nowhere else to go on the landlocked campus of the church. So in the end, a plan was hatched. In order to lighten the weight and the drag on the wall, it would be stripped of that beautiful ivy, and a construction crew would be brought in to install large steel I-beam girders slanting up from the ground to the wall to arrest its further collapse. They looked like the flying buttresses that gave strength to ancient cathedrals, only more industrial and terribly ugly. I learned all of this origin story in a meeting of the church property committee who years later, when I was there, were trying to decide what to do about those now years-old steel girders. The paint on them had faded and they were looking rusty, and the solution had never really been a good one to begin with. They were a convenient solution at an earlier time when church leaders didn't have the inclination to assert the real needs of the preschool and to request that the wall be repaired properly, and the retirement home didn't feel the desire to expend the funds necessary to do so. Our meeting, years later, recognized the folly of a haphazard solution that was undesirable for anyone because no one wanted to take on the economic burden or to venture to upset the harmony between neighbors. After that recognition was made, it was determined that the church should finally ask the retirement home to remove those ugly buttresses and repair the wall. But it was recognized, that would definitely make them upset at the cost and would result in having to put up with construction crews and the related noise and mess for an extended time. And so at last it was decided. In order to preserve the fragile tranquility of neighbors, we would paint the ugly buttresses and go on about our merry way. The broken and collapsing wall that nobody wanted was preserved once more. That was about 10 years ago now, and I'm wondering if it's still there today. There was a wall, if you will, just like that one, cracked and leaning, in the Gerasene community that Michelle read about for us just a moment ago also. That story may seem like a story about a single man healed of his spirit possession by Jesus, and it is. But there's a bigger story at play also, one that I think you might recognize even today. Whatever the historical realities may have been that led to stories of demon possession, this community had feared the man in question, but didn't know how to help. All their efforts to date hadn't brought the man any relief, nor had they given the community a sense of security. They feared the powers at play within him, and they had settled into a routine of restraining him time and time again. Things weren't getting any better, but they had learned to live with the anxiety of, quite literally, the demon they knew. Then Jesus came along and sent the demons packing right into a herd of pigs who, as you know, drowned themselves in the lake. It isn't clear whether this destroyed the evil spirits or simply pacified them so they would go away, but two things were true thereafter. The man who had been plagued with them was well and whole, and the pig farmers got started telling their side of the story. You may be aware that those who put time and effort and stake their livelihood on a particular thing do not take kindly when that thing is suddenly invaded by demons and drowned in a lake. This community, who had lived with their worries, was suddenly transformed. One of their citizens, who had by no fault of his own terrorized them for some time, was suddenly no threat at all, and he was in a better place personally. And a portion of their economy, and probably an individual family or two, paid the cost for all of that. One other thing was true too. There was a new power present in the town, and it was more powerful than the thing they'd been afraid of all this time. Upon a cursory reading, we might be lulled into thinking that celebration was in order. Healing had come to an individual and therefore to a community, and furthermore, the one who did the healing was still in town. It's time to line up and bring your worries and cares, folks. Jesus will be here a little longer. Except that didn't happen. And I suspect that didn't happen because honestly, that's not very real in our world. The people in that community still faced all sorts of unknowns. The source of their long-held fear was gone, sure, but they knew how to live with that anxiety. Now they had the anxiety of whether further intervention by Jesus would do further harm to their local economy. In fixing what else might have been broken for them, what else would he have to break? What of the fragile peace they had built would he turn upside down? There was before them the possibility of real and true redemption, transformed lives, and a transformed community. But the risk to the status quo was just too high. In the end, they asked Jesus to leave. In the end, they painted the old ugly buttresses too. I'm guessing we don't need to spend much time pointing out that there are walls just like that one all over the landscape of this world today too. If I were a betting person, I'd say you can count up a handful of circumstances and situations in your life, in your family, in your world, in which there is the possibility for real redemption. But you and those you love have not fully tabulated what the entire cost might be, or what fragile peace it might disturb to invite the redemption in. We certainly don't need to spend much time delineating the broken, leaning walls in our current social world at the moment. The decision that the Gerasene community made is basically our way of living these days. With so much broken about the way we live with each other, and with so many ideas and hopes and plans that could pave the way to a better tomorrow, somehow we still can't stop asking, but how much will it cost? There isn't a lot of fragile peace to be preserved in the larger story of our time, but those of us who have a choice about whether to weigh in and stand up certainly do find it a hard time inviting the redemption in for fear of the loss of our own individual peace. So on a cursory reading, yes, it would seem celebration was in line. But if we're willing to hold the story up to the real gritty truth of our lives and our world, I'm guessing it isn't a terribly surprising thing that the community politely asked Jesus to move on. What is surprising is that the one who had just cast demonic spirits against their will into a herd of pigs, who then ran against their will into the lake where they perished, received and honored the community's will, and he left town. He didn't force his agenda on them, as to do so wouldn't really be redemptive anyway. Transformation, it seems, is something that people and communities have to choose for themselves. So instead of turning the place upside down and casting out whatever other demons were around, he left someone behind who could tell their story. He left the man who had been healed, who understandably wanted to follow his healer and spend the balance of his days at his side. Rather than let him come along on his journey of healing and hope, Jesus told him to stay back in that reluctant community and tell his story of status quo breaking, very costly redemption. That's what it takes for communities to invest in that kind of redemption, to hear the stories time and again of those who know firsthand that the status quo isn't worth saving, and that fragile harmonies aren't worth preserving. Our question is, are we listening?